At about 9 or 10 years old, the day the showboat was coming, why, we all managed to get out on the riverbank and wait for it. Oftentimes, as it would come around the bend, it usually came upstream. As it come around the bend, why, they would play their calliope. Sometimes we call them calliope, sometimes calliope. But I got about the biggest thrill out of that old steam whistle, and I have some very fine symphonies. It really did give us a thrill. And I remember in particular, one day I happened to be at a point where I saw it first, and I was sort of the hero that day.
Absolutely. The one that comes with good tidings is always a pleasant herald.
Oh yes, it was. We had very little entertainment in Birmingham that we didn't create ourselves, and that was something that we all look forward to. The adults enjoyed it, I think.
And I suppose at that particular period, though, you had that, and in that sense, you were ahead of Benton, weren't you?
Well,
they weren't on a navigable stream.
Yeah. So that's the only time we ever got ahead of Benton.
Well, now, for the benefit of genealogists, and they have frequently used these talking books, could you tell us your father and your mother's name?
Yes, my father was Ernest Edward Whitehead. My mother was Bush Allison Whitehead. My mother's people were from western Kentucky, primarily around Marshall County, and also they had lived in Lyon County. I think around New Confederate, I believe they called the place.
Yes, I've heard of that town.
Then, of course, many years before I was born, they moved over to Birmingham.
All right. Do you perchance recall the grandparents on either side?
Yes, my grandfather on my mother's side was Elijah Allison. I think that family was related to some of the Allisons that formed the Presbyterian Church in Princeton, which stands today. Also, he had a brother in, I'm not sure whether that was Princeton or not, that was a doctor. I have a bit of a diary that he had written, and this was during the Civil War, and I remember a little poem that he had written regarding the Civil War. My grandmother was a Barnett, and I might add too that she had a brother named John. When I was a very small boy, she would read me letters that she had gotten from John Barnett in Texas. And as a young man, he went to Texas and managed to get in the cattle business and had a pretty good ranch. And they were driving their cattle to Kansas City to sell, and then he was coming back to Kentucky. And the Indians broke into the group and scattered the cattle. I don't think they killed any of the men. But he gave up on that and went back and settled in Texas. And I understand, I've heard of him and about him, his family, not in fairly recent years. And I think they did right well. Another interesting thing about that man, I had an uncle who was a cashier of a bank down in Hollow Rock Junction, Tennessee. And one day there was a man came in from this particular town in Texas. I forgot, Robert Lee, Texas. And my uncle asked him if by chance he knew this John Barnett. He said, oh yes. He said that his daddy rode as a deputy with him in when the cattle thieves were coming in. There were Mexicans, and they came in there in great droves and took the cattle away. Must have been almost like a battle. And he said that his daddy And the group met these Mexicans one day and said they killed 23 of them. Said that ended the cattle theft business right there. I remember also reading letters of, at the time, that he had ridden in an automobile and thought it was rather an interesting thing and said that the buckboard had had its day.
It turned out he was quite a good prophet at that point. Well, those are tremendously interesting
now,
things.
On my father's side, his mother and father were English people. And I might mention...
Did they come here from Virginia? Or?
No. My grandfather's name was John Bissell Whitehead. And his family was the Bissell and Whitehead foundry people in Birmingham, and that is Birmingham, England,
Mm-hmm.
and London. And they began to go broke. And when my great-grandfather died, the estate was put in the hands of a relative who was a doctor. And he disappeared. And my grandfather, who at that time was a young man, came to the United States looking for him. And he finally found him, and he said he was just an old drunken sot and wreck, and that he forgave him. My grandfather was really a very religious man all his life.
Mm-hmm.
And he went back to England, and I guess this is a little personal, but it makes an awful interesting story. He had a sweetheart that he was very fond of. In fact, I have a large portrait of her, oil painting, in my room, living room. And she died. And then he came back to the United States in due time, but he went back and he married this girl's kid sister, who was my grandmother. I thought that was sort of an interesting little
Well, it certainly is.
thing.
And
And she was a pal and a close relative of a very famous jewelry designer. My brother has one or two pieces of silver, beautiful plaques and pictures and that sort of thing that he designed. I'm really quite proud of him because he was a very famous and very well-known man.
Certainly.
Incidentally, those pieces are worth thousands and thousands of dollars now, too. They have to be kept somewhat of a safe place.
well, you have a right to be very pleased at that. Did you go to school in Birmingham?
I went and lived in Birmingham until I started in Birmingham. And then for the second year of my school, that is
You
grade
remember
school,
your first teacher?
Sir, the last name was Cox. I don't remember her first name.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went to St. Louis and lived in St. Louis with my father's people. Incidentally, at this point, I'd better say that my mother died when I was born, and my grandmother raised me up to a point there of about 6, 7 years old. Then I lived at my father's home through 1 year, and then I came back. I won't go into the details of that, but anyway, when I came back, I lived in Birmingham, and I lived with my mother's sisters, each one of them a different period of time there, until I was 12 years old. That pretty well was the end of my Birmingham experience. So if you want to...
The family then later moved to, what,
Yes.
Benton?
No, we moved to Paducah.
Uh-huh.
At that time I was living with my uncle and aunt, Carl and May Walker. And we lived in Paducah for a while, and I moved to Benton from Paducah about the beginning of 1921. I guess was about the end of 20, somewhere.
So
December.
you went to high school in
I
Benton.
went to high school in Benton.
Uh-huh. Now, do you remember any of your high school teachers?
Oh yes, Ethel May Stevens. She was from Wisconsin. She taught English, and she also taught English history.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, she was a wonderful person. But she was a Yankee out of Wisconsin or somewhere, and she had a little bit of trouble adjusting to the Southern type of humor in life, I think. But I'm not criticizing. I love her. She was a wonderful person.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I was taking English history, which I was somewhat interested in because of my family background. And we went through the Shakespeare period there of the point where the people were rather rude, and they, eating at the table, they'd throw the bones over their shoulders for their dogs that was back in the room there. And Queen Elizabeth put the buttons on the sleeves for sanitary purposes.
Yeah. Keep them from wiping their nose
Yeah,
and mouth.
uh-huh.
Yes.
So then a little bit later, we got into the English class, and I was supposed to write something about a Shakespearean play. Well, I didn't write about the play, but I wrote about the real, sure enough, English history. And the class just laughed, and it was a complete wreck. And I had several things of that nature that would come up. So one day, I had the flu and was sick for 2 or 3 days, and Miss Stevens met my aunt, who I was living with. And she asked about how I was feeling, and she said, oh, pretty good. He'll be back a few days. She says, I really think that he will make a great writer sometimes if he can stay out of the penitentiary. Well, that sure didn't go well with my aunt. I had a little explaining to do when I got home.
Well, you, after you finished high school, sometime or other you became an engineer. Could you tell us how you got into
Well,
that?
that was a way down the road.
Way down the road. Well, let's get some intervening things
Yes.
in. What did you do? Someone told me once that you ran a store in Benton.
Yes. When I got out of high school, we were really in my uncle was quite sick, and I wasn't working, and my aunt ran a little millinery store there about the middle of the west side of the Court Square. And first job I had when I got out of high school was working with a survey party that surveyed Highway 68 from Benton to Egner's Ferry, or Aurora.
Mm-hmm.
And my job was on the business end of a 37.5-pound maul, driving these pipe in the ground, sounding for bridges.
Mm-hmm.
And we had rather a pleasant time of it. I enjoyed it. By the way, by the time we got through, I was so strong I didn't realize how strong I was. And Paul Jones was on that crew, and Albert Ely, and Amos Penny. And I enjoy thinking about it, and it was, even though it was awfully hard work, and we would take this car right out through the fields or the muds or the woods. If a tree got in the way, we'd just cut them down and carry the car on through to wherever our sounding place would be. Following that, I went to St. Louis to try to find work, and I lived at my daddy's home. A very pleasant experience that I had there. But I couldn't find a job, so he was a civil engineer. He was with the old Mississippi River Commission, and a very prominent engineer in that field. He would go out in charge of large survey parties, well, all of his life.
Mm-hmm.
On the lower Mississippi River mostly. Later, that thing became more involved with the U.S. engineers. I believe there was some sort of a division in the two units. I don't remember just how it was. Anyway, he did get me this job, and I was very fortunate in that we were surveying on the Atchafalaya River for the first levees that would be built south of, I believe it was Simisport. And incidentally, these floods they're having there is through that country. The Atchafalaya, when I first went there, was filled, the banks was filled with wonderful cypress trees. Most of them were at least a yard wide at the bottom. And they had a lot of that Spanish moss on them. And it was just a dream world. It was a beautiful place. Of course, there were many mosquitoes and a lot of snakes and an occasional alligator. In fact, we carried small axes because of the alligators. If we did run into one, we should not give him any trouble and try to avoid him, but to stay away from his tail. He'd hit you with the tail first.
Mm-hmm.
And you was to take this axe, if you did have an encounter with him, and hit him right behind the head, just a sharp blow with this little axe, and that would sever the spinal column, and then you could get out of it all right. Otherwise, you had a bad problem.
Yeah.
I've seen them, but I never did have any trouble with one. The scamps are hard to see, too. They look like an old log or something.
Yes.
Anyway, we went ahead and made the survey on this river. Many adventures, some kind of dangerous, but most of them very interesting, until we got down into the lake territory. I learned a lot about steamboats. The river people and the engineering group are two different status. They don't really mix too much. And I got in a little bit of trouble there one time with the captain because I was running around with one of the firemen. I thought both of them were quite interesting characters, adventurous fellows.
But they didn't like
So,
one another.
No, they didn't like me as an upper deck surveying man to be associating with the lower deck.
Yeah.
And so he sent me down in the hole of the ship to scrape rust off there for 3-4 hours.
As punishment.
That's punishment, you bet. Very much so. But he was a very fair and very man. But I was in a new field and in something that I wasn't doing things I wasn't supposed to do.
Well, how did you come to return to Benton as a merchant?
Well, that river life was rather rough. And believe it or not, I always wanted to be a pretty good boy. And I decided that I couldn't be a very good boy and live on the river. That's really a wild, rough life. So I just quit. And I came back and I managed to get a job with the Bell Telephone Company as manager of the office here in Benton, which at that time was upstairs on the south side of the courthouse, and I suppose it was over about the 4th building from the east side. They've changed it so much now, I really don't remember just
You
where.
managed the Bell telephone
Yes,
office.
that's right.
Well,
And-
let me interject here.
Sure.
When did you meet your wife?
Oh man, that was years later.
Years later.
Yeah.
Okay. I just didn't want to let it sneak up on us here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if you want me to jump some years.
Well, that's all right. Now, go ahead on the theme you're on, if you'd like.
I worked with that telephone. They later moved the office down where the Baptist church, it's on the south side of the court square. I don't remember what they call it. But they put a new telephone office there, and I operated that thing for about 10 years,
Mhm.
9 or 10 years. And then I bought J.D. Peterson's hardware store. And I operated that in the latter 30s. I think I was in there about 3 or 4 years. At that time, Shelby had a theater that was next door to my store. I catered primarily to the farm store, the hardware business.
But I believe you had home appliances.
Yes, I had many things in there. I would spread my capital which wasn't an awful lot, but I did spread it as wide as I could to cover as many people as I could. And my aunt had moved her ladies' ready-to-wear and millinery store into my building. We had it kind of subdivided. And I sold appliances. In there, I might mention, too, even back in the 20s, I became interested in building radios. They were simple devices, but I had the second radio that was in Marshall County. And
Well,
wasn't that interesting?
That's
I
really
was
something.
somewhat just coming out of the Boy Scout age at that time, and I became interested.
Mhm.
In one of my many visits to St. Louis, I heard my first radio at one of these outdoor theaters. And as you would go in, they'd hold the receiver up and let you listen to one of the local stations. And it seemed to me like it was just impossible.
Yeah.
So I discovered they were not too terribly complex to build, but I had a little bit of trouble getting to work. I finally got her to work, and it took all the money I had. I had sold papers, and I think I had $14, and I invested that in the radio.
Yes.
And one of my relatives heard about it, and I guess he was more conservative than I was, and he said, "A fool and his money are soon parted," and I never have quite forgiven him for it. I know it must have seemed terribly silly then, but I made her work.
But you learned some things that were
yes,
valuable to you also.
I used to install radios after they became commercially available and popular.
Mhm.
I used to help have the antenna put up right and fix their ground wires and actually make connections and put them right. And I'd oftentimes think of some of the experiences that happened in that. I was installing a radio at Joe Lovett. I don't. Do you remember Joe Lovett? He was ran the newspaper.
Yes, I remember him.
And
His son and I were in college together and on the debate team.
well, I was
Wells Lovett.
in there in the living room trying to get this radio thing hooked up, and all of a sudden, his wife screamed, and I ran back, and the kitchen is on fire. The oil stove, something had happened to it. So I took the stove out. I think I first removed the coal oil thing on it so it couldn't blow up. Got it out in the yard, then I pulled the stove out on the porch so that the flames couldn't touch anything. It would just burn the oil that was on the stove.
Yes.
And then I got in and tore the wallpaper off, which was burning. I got that all torn off down to the ceiling. I still don't know how I did it, but I got her off. And then Mrs. Lovett and I looked at my hands, and man, they was a mess. So she grabbed up a box of soda and opened up a can or something of sorghum molasses and put it in a dish or a bowl and stirred it up and grabbed both of my hands and slapped them down in there and just rubbed that stuff all over them. And she said, "Now you leave them alone a while." And that just, I guess there was a week or two that they were a little bit sore, but that sure did.
It did the job.
Did the job. Oh, and then there was always something coming up, not that dramatic, but it was quite an interesting. I was real proud to be able to do those things. I took a lot of pride in it.
Shelby was telling a wild tale out here a while ago before he left about a promoter coming to town that took nearly everybody for a ride on bringing a show to town and getting the merchants to give prizes and so
Yeah,
forth.
that was almost an unbelievable thing. He was so smooth. He was representing the American Legion, and his wife came to my store, and I signed up, and actually she was a very sensitive and sensible and nice person. not particularly pretty, but extremely nice. And I believe I was going to put a refrigerator up. The scheme was such that you would be paid for the merchandise after the show was over that he was promoting as a carnival there. And I really didn't pay just an awful lot of attention to the details of the thing. However, I did send my refrigerator out, and then after the first day or so, I went out to see some of the shows, and by that time, actually, it was beginning to fall apart. I never did really get to see much of the show or the performance.
But had it been honest, they would have had enough money to pay
everything.
everything.
A good thing. Now, that was, as I remember, that was about strawberry picking time, which brought a lot of money into the territory. But something happened, and I don't remember what it was, but we really didn't have the exposure that I thought we would have. But,
well, you know, we're down to just 5 minutes left
yes.
on the tape, so let's try to get you up to Korean and in engineering some way or another.
All right. I went to, I'd been with a telephone company, and frankly, I thought they were sort of a bunch of taking money that they could have reduced their rates and made things more reasonable for everybody. So anyway, I wanted to find a politician that I could talk to and get on the commission in Frankfurt that could really put in some facts about the thing. And I went over between the rivers looking for a politician. His name was, it doesn't matter what it was, but I found one. And it turned out to be Korean. And I met her father at a little store, and he had some, he had spent a lot of time in the West, and he invited me to his home. And I saw Corinne. She came out, her sister, to meet me as a perfect stranger. And frankly, I thought she was the sweetest, nicest thing I ever saw.
Yeah.
And she was just a kid, and by then I was sort of up in years. I mean, I wasn't exactly a kid anymore. So eventually I talked her into marrying me.
And you're glad you did.
And I'm so glad I did. I think that she's
And
nice.
you have a son.
Yes, my son
Is that the only child?
yes, we just have.
And I believe he has finished his engineering work at Murray and is
Yes.
now in Fort Wayne, is it?
He's in Fort Wayne now with the Magnavox people, and he's just been promoted into a very nice job. It is dealing with the engineering requirements on government contracts. It's a far more responsible and business job than anything that I was in. I was in the insurance business shortly after I married Corinne, and I went from there into the machine design business. I had some mathematics and was always able to draw, and you know, my civil engineering experience made it not too hard. So anyway, I worked on government contracts during the war, mostly in airplanes. We were in Akron, Ohio. It was a very hectic time. Of course, it was hectic for everybody, but we worked long hours. And
Now, before your recent retirement, you were working where?
I've worked everywhere nearly. I've worked in North Carolina, St. Louis, Nashville, New Orleans, out in the state of Washington, Richland, Washington, out in the desert. The most of it has been, I worked on space.
Richland, was that an atomic energy?
That was a big one. I
Yes.
worked on the designed the valve out there. The gate on that son of a gun weighed 4,000 pounds, and I had it to where it could be manipulated rather easy. I've enjoyed all of my work. I think the thing that I enjoyed most was working on the spacecraft in New Orleans. I was on the Saturn S-1B, and I had a very responsible position. You know, it's interesting, in the man that I worked with in New Orleans, I went out to Richland, and I checked the phone book there, and by golly, I wound up with my desk in 15 feet of his.
Well, what a coincidence.
Yeah, Also, I was working in Little Rock, Arkansas on the design of a plane for the Coast Guard. And I wound up there with a man that I had worked with, been real close to in St. Louis. I worked in St. Louis for about 10 years on that armament sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've designed almost anything that I can think of to kill people. Machine guns, aircraft, radar mechanisms, rocket launchers for ships.
They've been in defense of America.
Yes, I don't know. I wonder about it sometimes. Frankly, Doctor, I think war is silly any way you look at it. But I'm not smart enough to know what to say or what to do about it. Life is such that people do need defense. I do wish that my work in life had been developed more toward the art, illustration, poetic, sensitive writing.
I've seen some of the cards you've designed, and you have a big talent in that area, too.
Well, I enjoy it so much, and thank you, Doctor. I've enjoyed working on those. Right now, I'm working on some of those. I've enjoyed working on those. Right now, I'm working on some of those, that type thing.
Mr. Whitehead, is there anything in particular you'd like to sum up in the last minute or so that we've overlooked?
Well, there's so many things. I can't make it a minute or so. I get an awful lot of pleasure out of nature. And looking at life, I certainly hope that we are all able to live contented and happy and sensible. And sensible, I mean sensible, and contented lives that add up to making life a pleasure instead of a burden. I'm terribly concerned about the atomic possibilities that we have of destroying our civilization, maybe
Yes.
even life in general, and I do wish that people could be happy.
Well, thank you very much. The time has gone all too rapidly. Our guest has been Mr. Ernest Bush Whitehead, graduate of Benton High School and a man of many, many talents, as those of you who have listened through the tape are, of course, aware. I'm Ray Mofield. The program is being produced for the State Archives in Frankfort, for the Murray State University Pogue Oral History Library, and for the Marshall County Library. And that concludes our broadcast for today.